Okay, so if we could, I think we'll start with the next panel. So if Andrea, if you could come forward with your team, that would be wonderful. So we need Andrea Bjorklund, Ugo Perezcano Diaz, Uchiero Onwumegbu, Howard Mann, and Elizabeth Turk by video. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea Bjorklund. I teach at McGill University in Montreal, and I'm delighted to be here. I thank Armand and Una for the invitation. So I have the honor of chairing our panel with the somewhat daunting task of covering the rest of the world. Compared to what we've already looked at. Our speakers have very kindly agreed to keep very strictly to time because we have several speakers and not very much time. So we will go in the order they appear on the program, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ugo Perezcano Diaz, and I will not repeat what is in the bios of our speakers because of in the interest of time, but it is a great pleasure to have Hugo lead us off.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here to share the floor and the conference with my distinguished colleagues, longtime friends, and be part of this panel. So I thank CIGI for organizing the event, having invited me to write a paper on this topic, and being able to participate today. The paper that I wrote addresses the possible reaction of developing countries if developed countries were to begin excluding ISDS from agreements between themselves. Now, we've heard a lot during the course of the morning about developed and developing democracies. I don't like the terminology. I think it's confusing. I think it blurs one of the issues. I like more the reference to developing and developed countries. It is tied into, well, there is no universally accepted definition of what is a developed country or a developing country. It is used by international organizations. It is tied into objective economic indicators, and I think it reflects the level of economic development does reflect on a country's institutions, whether they are more or less responsive, on whether their regulatory systems are, again, more or less responsive as well. And I think it's hard to, I wonder, and I've been wondering throughout the morning, what or who defines what is a developed democracy as opposed to a developing or underdeveloped democracy. So I try to stay away from that terminology. Anyhow, having made that clarification at the outset, I think it raises the question of whether some countries should selectively exclude investor-state dispute settlement or even just the arbitration part of dispute settlement selectively from certain agreement raises a host of questions. I don't think it resolves any problems, as David Schneiderman said earlier on. I think that I would fully agree with you that ISDS is not going to go away for the foreseeable future. So whether some countries begin to exclude it or not, countries are still going to face, and I would say the same countries will continue to face these cases, and probably or most likely incrementally. So again, I don't think it resolves any question and any problems, and it raises or creates others. So one of the things, somebody said it, I think it was Charles-Emmanuel this morning, who pointed to the issue. I think one of the points that has been overlooked is that there is really, I don't think there is a big overlap, if there is any overlap at all, between the type of issues that ISDS is meant to address as opposed to domestic law. Investor state dispute settlement is a forum to resolve international law claims. And while there may be similar protections, and of course we heard Julie this morning at least raising or asking the question whether certain systems, the German system as opposed to others, offer more or less protection than the international law or the international rules do. The truth is that we are dealing with two separate systems of law. And international dispute settlement is meant to address claims of violations to international law, not domestic law claims. And even if we're dealing with the same issue, the standards may be quite different. Even if both domestic law and international law offer protections against expropriation, for instance, the standards may be quite different. In some cases, it may be argued that the domestic standards are better standards than those that provided for international law. And in other cases, it may be different. But the questions, again, the standards are different. And one of the main problems that I see here is that by withdrawing or retreating from ISDS generally, if, for instance, a country's ability to regulate is hindered in any way, it is really not because of the dispute settlement system, but actually because of the substantive rules that are written into treaties. So if by withdrawing from ISDS, the actual source of the problem is left there unaddressed. So to the extent that rules are not written clearly in the agreements, or perhaps even are drafted incorrectly, then the problem remains. The same goes for other criticisms that we heard throughout the morning, for instance, procedural flaws. By withdrawing from ISDS, any procedural flaws, whether it is the appointment of arbitrators or any perceived, let me put it that way, procedural flaws, whether it's the appointment of arbitrators, whether these are the rules on transparency, again, they are left unaddressed. And if certain countries ultimately, for instance, going back to the regulatory chill, the right to regulate, if certain countries, developed countries, for instance, withdraw from ISDS because they want to preserve their ability to regulate, why should developing countries not have the same right to regulate? I argue in my paper perhaps even a greater right to regulate, since their systems, because they are developing countries, are or will be more often than not less developed as well. So again, I'll finish with this. I don't think that developing countries, and given all the political rhetoric that is out there today, if some countries start withdrawing selectively, I don't think that developing countries will remain impassive. And it may even feed into the current political rhetoric, whether in Latin America or elsewhere. And ultimately, again, I think it creates other problems. we have, or one of the main criticisms is that we have a fragmented system, but if we continue to do this selectively, then we'll have a greater problem of fragmentation at different levels. So again, I think probably the best way to do it, or this at least is an argument for considering again whether there should be a multilateral or a global approach to investment protection, given that, as we heard from the ambassador earlier on, most countries are, or in the earlier panels as well, most countries still think that investment protection is important, and ISDS, I would say, is only one of the many components that make that investment protection. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
I'm very impressed. You've set an excellent standard for us, both in terms of substance and in terms of timekeeping. So thank you very much. Now I present to you Ucheora Onwuemegbu, who works at Arent Fox and used to be at ICSID. Uche.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, yeah, that's my 10 minutes going. Thank you. Okay, so my paper focuses on how a decision to remove ISDR from treaties between developed countries, how that would affect the system of investor state arbitration as we know it. And I realize I use the word system rather loosely, but by this I'm simply referring to the system that's in place today by which these disputes are resolved under ICSID or the ancestral rules. Now, of course, there are other rules like the ICC, PCA, Stockholm Chamber, LCA, and so on, but for present purposes, I'm only focusing on ICSID and ancestral. I should emphasize at the outset, though, that the system is well beyond investment treaty arbitration. And this is important. It includes arbitration under contracts and laws. And the last time I checked, almost 25% of the cases that's been registered by ICSID to date have been under laws and contracts. So, just in case I run out of time or if I lose you to sleep, seeing as it's after lunch, here's a summary of what I intend to cover in the next 8 minutes or so. The investment arbitration system has evolved significantly over the past 2 decades. Now, that evolution has been driven by changes introduced by governments, primarily Canada and the US, in their investment treaties. Now, those treaty provisions were introduced as a result of Canada and the US being faced with a real, as opposed to academic, prospect of being respondents in investment arbitration, investor state arbitration. And so, my contention is that removing such provisions in treaties between developed countries would also, in effect, remove the prospect of such countries being respondents in the system. And so in the long term, this would affect the dynamism with which the system evolves. As we heard earlier, developing countries will likely follow the example of developed countries, and ultimately, it's the investors around the world that will bear the brunt of such a move. So, we've heard about the changes that's happened in the past couple of decades. We've heard quite a lot about that this morning. There's been movement on transparency. There have been introduction of provisions for increased efficiency. Scope has been redefined. There are new concepts like the loser pays principle. There's talk about the introduction of a code of conduct and even of the court system that I'll come back to. Now, I'm not at this point saying whether these are right or wrong. I'm just pointing them out as things that have happened in the past couple of decades. And these are things that come from governments expressing their rights under the principle of party autonomy in arbitration and including in their treaties provisions that modify the standard arbitration rules of ICSID and UNCITRAL. And I say that the reason behind all this is that prospect of being sued becoming real. In fact, to borrow a bit from what David Gans said earlier today, nothing clears the mind like the prospect of being sued. And in fact, I would say that nothing really concentrates the mind like the experience you get from having been sued. And so, although there's always been the possibility under treaties for developed countries to be respondents in investor state arbitration, this was merely academic. Now, when, however, that prospect became real, the treaties began to be signed, including provisions like we've seen earlier today. And even more changes were included and made to the system when actual cases were filed. Now, whether you consider this good or bad, or the changes that have been introduced, whether you consider them to be good or bad, there is no doubt that they have influenced the system and basically helped the system to grow. And so, removing investor state arbitration provisions from these treaties will, in effect, like I said, remove the prospect or the real prospect of such countries being, being respondents. And so, since countries negotiate treaties on the basis of national interest, in future treaties between developed and developing countries, for example, there'll be little reason for them or for developed countries to insist on or agree to provisions protecting the side of the state. Now, this would eventually have a chilling effect on the vibrant evolution of the system. Now, the other point is one that Ugo mentioned earlier, which is that developing countries are likely to follow suit. The idea being, if this is not good enough for you, then it certainly isn't good enough for us. And in any event, there remains a whole universe of treaties, contracts, and laws, the basis of which proceedings will continue to be brought under the investor state arbitration system for the foreseeable future. And so this means that investors are locked into the present system for some time to come. It therefore becomes necessary to make sure that the system works and that it works well. Otherwise, the losers, like I said, would be the investors from all over the world. And so looking ahead, it doesn't seem like we have a viable alternative to the present system yet. The draft proposal that we've heard under the TTIP has its issues. Among them, of course, is the question of multiplicity or duplicity of systems. Back in 2004, when ICSID first mooted the idea of an appellate mechanism for the system, it didn't quite fly. But one thing that everybody agreed on was the need to have a universal system as opposed to one or as opposed to multiple systems. Because what's going to happen is that the coherence which is sought to be addressed by this approach will be impacted. And so if the system is to remain to serve the investors around the world, it's important that everybody remains engaged, both as claimant and as respondent. And then one thing that this whole debate raises is, we've come to see that the evolution of the system seems to rely on how the users react to the different shifts in the wind. So perhaps it's time for the system to have its own mechanism for evolving without having to rely on who stays in and who leaves. I think I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Uche. Our next speaker is Howard Mann.
Thank you, in particular, Hugo and Uche, for leaving me so much extra time. I want to start by going back a couple of steps. Hugo mentioned a few minutes ago that the Investor State Arbitration system is designed to resolve international law claims. But about what? And the what is extremely important here. So I'm going to connect that comment Hugo just made to a conference the wonderfully colorful Stephen Clarkson organized a little while ago in Germany, where the first item on the agenda was the governance of arbitration. And I wrote an email to Stephen in regards to that title saying the problem isn't the governance of arbitration, the problem is the concept of the arbitration of governance. And that's the what here. That is the type of issues that are being addressed in this system and arbitrated in a system designed to reflect commercial arbitration approaches when fundamentally they are addressing issues of governance, and issues of governance that apply to developed countries and developing countries equally. And applying a model of commercial arbitration through private persons, often with no or very little experience in government or in governance, very little accountability. The arbitrators have a virtually unlimited legal right to be wrong in law. And that's a system that ought to be extremely troubling, but it's foundational to the way arbitration is approached today across most legal systems. The arbitrators have a right to be wrong in law. When you apply that to government actions with a multitude of stakeholder interests involved, that type of approach seems to me fundamentally wrong. And the arbitrators continue to argue for greater rights to be wrong in law, even as it relates to issues of jurisdiction. And I know Andrea and I have had this discussion before on several occasions. The lack of appeal, the problem of inconsistent interpretations. Governments simply don't know what the law is. The Bridget Stern approach to fair and equitable treatment is very different to the approach of Arrigo Vicuña. Who will you get on your tribunal? You don't know. The government simply have no way to know how to meet these markers in many cases. When it comes to fundamental governance issues, that's simply an impossible standard. The issues of conflict of interest of the arbitrators and so on. These represent significant issues. The lack of diversity, what no less an arbitrator than Yves Fortier called the mafia. The ability to be selected to the elite club of arbitrators that he called the mafia. And that's actually in an interview in Canadian Lawyer in 2003 or 2004. The EU proposal, it should be noted, does away with arbitration as we know it. It fundamentally replaces arbitration with a judicially structured dispute settlement system. And I think that needs to be understood as a fundamental issue here and fundamental change in terms of the nature of the proposal. And so we need to distinguish here the issue between investor-state arbitration as the solution versus the question, what should investor-state dispute settlement look like if indeed there should be investor-state dispute settlement at all? But it shouldn't be a given, it can only be arbitration. Second, the discourse here today And Hugo raised it earlier, and a couple of other people have by the by. But the discourse here today fundamentally assumes the underlying law is correct, and the underlying approach to investor rights and the construction of investor treaties today with investor rights and largely no obligations, the shields to investor liability that investors have built into the system and so on, is the right approach. And at the end of the day, unless we address the underlying legal rights and the issues that come with that, simply fixing the dispute settlement system won't resolve the problem. So I think that's a second issue that needs to be addressed. And what's come about of the role of investor state arbitration today is its shift from a shield from government action to a threat against the use of government measures by a government. It is now a sword of first recourse. We will sue you and sue you in arbitration for millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, billions of dollars now. And with the awards now over $1 billion in several instances, it is not an empty threat. So those issues really matter in terms of how we define these kinds of issues. And the uncertainty that I referred to earlier and that others have is fundamental. Who bears the risk of that uncertainty in the law, of that variety of interpretations? Only governments pay damages. Governments bear that risk exclusively in the face of a threat to use the system. So clarity becomes a critical issue. Taking that back to the rest of the world, issues per se, I think we need to look where a lot of the trends are going now. India, looking to pull out. A new model that will not institute investor-state dispute settlement. Brazil, not going in. Never have, never will. The chances of Brazil going in are very unlikely. And their investors have found another way. We call it treaty shopping. Others call it locational choices. And their foreign investors, Vale is now headquartered itself, like Philip Morris, in Switzerland to make its international investments out of Switzerland, so they have coverage of the Swiss treaties in that case. Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, a number of other governments, smaller states that are beginning to pull out. One of the reasons for that, actually, and there's always a stick that breaks the camel's back, turns out to be the letters that were on the John Oliver show, threats to institute suits by big tobacco against many smaller countries if they took the same kind of tobacco control measures that Uruguay and Australia took. Those letters exist. John Oliver had it on his HBO show and was waving one for Namibia. I've seen those letters for 6 or 7 different countries. Those are there. And the reaction of those countries, quite simply, is, screw this, we've had enough. And they are preparing to pull out. The abuse of the system in that way has motivated them to say, we've had enough, we don't need this, and we don't need those kinds of risks, and we don't need that kind of interference in basic governance issues to protect our people. The argument that's often put about that developing countries will want to maintain the system because now there's a lot of foreign investors coming out of developing countries. From the developing countries that I work with, including some of the biggest ones and some of the smallest ones, the argument there on a cost-benefit analysis simply doesn't hold. It just doesn't hold. They're far more exposed in terms of the number or the volume of investment into their countries than the volume of investment coming out, and their foreign investors do have the option of treaty shopping, and they know it, and that's the response that largely comes from that. The biggest exception to that, of course, is China, but even in China now, they are beginning to review the level of the push that they've had over the last 2 years towards, or last 10 years or so, towards investor-state dispute settlement. I think we see some of these changes going on. I would argue, like both the previous speakers have, that if developed countries pull out between themselves, the motivation for developing countries to look like developed countries, which is a real motivator within government in terms of signing these agreements. We want to play on the same playing field. We want to look like big boys now. And I apologize if the language sounds offensive, but in a lot of ways that's really it. That motivation will simply disappear. But I would say in the alternative, that because developed countries may not pull out or don't change the system to a more judicial approach, does not mean developing countries will continue to support it. The trend to rethink and review adherence to investor state arbitration is firmly planted and is going to expand whether or not developed countries pull out. And the opportunity to have a more universal approach, I think, lies somewhere in the middle there in terms of an opportunity looking forward today.
Thank you. We now are going to hear, we hope, from Elizabeth Turk from UNCTAD by pre-recorded video.
Thank you for inviting UNCTAD to contribute to the conference Investor State Arbitration between Developed Democracies, a Policy Under Challenge. It's a great pleasure for me to share our work on the reform of international investment governance, as we most recently published it in our World Investment Report. That's our division's flagship publication, where, amongst others, we give trends on international investment agreements, and this year have the special theme of IRA reform. Your conference focuses on the possibility and desirability to replace investor-state dispute settlement when concluding international investment agreements between state parties which are developed democracies. At UNCTAD, we look at this question from the broader perspective of reforming international investment governance. There's a pressing need for systematic reform of the global IRA regime to ensure that it works for all stakeholders. Today, the question is not about whether or not to reform, but about the what, the how, and the extent of this reform. Investor-state dispute settlement is at the heart of the IRA reform debate, and Chapter 4 of our World Investment Report, WIR 2015, identifies improving investment dispute settlement as one of the 5 challenges which IRA reform should tackle. WIR 2015 also presents the type of actions that governments could take in order to reform investor-state dispute settlement. It groups them in the following way, also presented in a visual on page 147 of the WIR. The 3 groups of actions or of options are the following. First, fixing the existing system. Second, adding new elements to the existing system. And third, replacing the existing system altogether. WIR 2015 helps identify the pros and cons for each of these policy options. In so doing, the WIR helps policymakers to pick and choose those reform options and those reform tools that are best used to their or best suited to their particular policy objectives. For your conference on investor-state arbitration between developed democracies, the question of to have or not to have ISDS is the crucial one. WIR 2015 also addresses this issue, notably by providing a table offering the main arguments advanced in favor and against ISDS. This table, you can again find it on page 147 of the 2015 WIR, aims to foster debate among stakeholders and to support informed decision-making by policymakers. I think it can also provide valuable input into your deliberations. Some of the arguments included in the table are relevant for treaties independently of the type of state parties to them. One example on the pro side is allowing for the recognition and enforcement of the decision in many jurisdictions. That is through the combined effect of the ICSID and the New York Conventions. On the con side are costs, and most importantly, some of the broader legitimacy challenges surrounding the current functioning of the ISDS regime. One argument listed in the table and often used in favor of ISDS may be of particular interest to you, as you are discussing the pros and cons of keeping ISDS between developed democracies. ISDS supporters often argue that an important advantage lies in allowing foreign investors to avoid the national courts of the host state if they have little trust in their independence, their efficiency, and their competence. This is indeed an important point. Some may even consider this as the key raison d'être of ISDS. At the same time, there are questions to what extent this advantage of ISDS is needed when we are talking about an agreement between developed democracies. Developed democracies generally are characterized by strong and independent judicial systems. In this sense, this particular argument maybe has to be seen in a different light. Should states consider discarding or limiting the recourse to ISDS in their future IIAs, the WIR 2015 identifies three options. First, they can rely exclusively on domestic dispute resolution in the host state of their investment. Second, they can replace ISDS with a state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism. And thirdly, they can adopt an in-between approach, for example, introducing local litigation requirements as a precondition of resorting to ISDS. The first two options just identified have the effect of replacing ISDS altogether, while the last one is rather aimed at tailoring the existing system. States can focus on one of the options or can pursue them in parallel or in combination. For example, domestic litigation requirements can be combined with ISDS, can be a precondition to ISDS, or it can be combined with state-state dispute settlement. Recent treaties replacing ISDS with domestic litigation, such as the Australia-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, or the Brazil, Angola, and Brazil-Mozambique Cooperation Facilitation Investment Agreements, seem to follow this path. These treaties combine domestic proceedings with state-state proceedings. Let me briefly elaborate on the rationales and implications of each of these three options. I will keep this short. I invite you to consult our World Investment Report for the details. First, exclusive reliance on domestic dispute resolution. This means opting for abolishing investors' rights to bring claims against host states before international tribunals, international arbitration tribunals. This turns domestic judicial institutions into the only and final mechanism for settling investment-related disputes with the state. It has been noted that this option has its merit mainly in countries with sound legal systems, good governance, and local courts expertise. This is an issue that is also of particular importance for the type of questions you are addressing today. When going down that road, policymakers should be aware of the pros and cons. In the WIR, you find pros, for example, that at a broader level, this option would also support domestic reforms aimed at well-working legal and judicial institutions in host states. And you find cons in the WIR, for example, that many local courts may not have the legal competence to apply international agreements. This is the case in a number of developed democracies which abide by the dualist vision of international law. The United Kingdom is an example of this. Briefly now, the second option of replacing ISDS with state-state dispute settlement. When speaking of replacing ISDS with state-state dispute settlement, It is important to note that state-state dispute settlement is in fact part of virtually all existing IRAs. The novelty of this policy option is that the state-state mechanism will become the only international forum for settling investment disputes. Again, this option has pros and cons. On the pro side, this option may reinstate countries' confidence in the IRA regime, for example by filtering frivolous claims and avoiding controversial legal issues related to public policy challenges. On the con side, state-state procedures may prove more cumbersome and more lengthy for investors because of bureaucracy in the state involved. Let me now turn to the third option, which is introducing local litigation requirements as a precondition for ISDS. This is a final option, and this is an option of interest to countries wishing to preserve the role of their local courts. This could be done along the lines of two alternative approaches. First, state parties could require the exhaustion of local remedies as a precondition for referring a claim to ISDS. Second, states could adopt a local litigation requirement that is limited in time, under which recourse to ISDS happens only after a certain amount of time has elapsed. You can again find the pros and cons spelled out in the WIR. With this, I will conclude my brief remarks. I hope I have given you some valuable input for your discussion. Please note that following your requests to focus on the question of having or not having ISDS, I have not touched on some of the other interesting issues that we address in the WIR. To give you examples, we look at improvements to ISDS, we look at the addition of an appeals facility, or at the creation of an international court. But I hope that I have raised your interest in UNCTAD's work on IRA reform and on ISDS in particular, and I hope that in your work, in your deliberations, you will also look at our material and publications. In UNCTAD, we look forward to the results of your work. If you share them with us, we would be pleased to upload your findings on the website as part of the so-called Report Back project. That's an online platform where we share the outcomes of other initiatives that address IRA reform. And through that online platform, these other outcomes, these experiences and lessons learned feed into UNCTAD's intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder process on IRA reform. With this, I thank you for your attention.
Great. I now have the pleasure of welcoming Julie Maupin, who has agreed to be a commentator on our panelists' presentations today. Julie? We probably will have very little, but we will. I think that maybe audience discussion can be folded into the next panel's question and answer session. So I'm prepared to give the rest of the time to you.
No. I want to make sure you've all heard from me enough today, so I'd rather than hear from you. In that case, I will just pose a couple of questions, actually, rather than comments to a couple of the panelists. I have lots of questions for all of you, but I think other people in the audience should have some chance to do that as well. First, let's see, who should I put on the spot? I'll put Uche on the spot first. So my question to you is there a workable way to design an appellate body that is short of a full-on investment court? Because you mentioned some of the exit attempts prior to do that and the rejection of those attempts in very strong terms from a number of members of the arbitration community. And then secondly, to Howard, you go by Howie, right? Yes. Howie, you called the European Commission's new TTIP proposal a fundamental shift. And my question for you is the shift fundamental enough, also as regards the substantive law, which you stressed as being very important, rightly so, to actually address the concerns of the environmental and human rights and labor rights communities and others who have been critical of ISDS in the past? I note that many of these groups are also not thrilled with the way that the WTO operates, and the European Commission's proposal has many parallels to the WTO. So I'll leave it at that, and then we'll have more time for audience questions.
Thank you, Julie. Because the Exit Convention prohibits appeals, the only way to get around that is by another treaty. Now, that's what the TTIP proposal is aiming to do. But the problem there is that it's bilateral. What we proposed back in 2004 is a multilateral treaty type of approach. And that frankly is about the only way to make it work. Because if you start going about it this way, it's uncertain how long the process will take, and then what happens between now and then, if we ever get to that point. And I mean, there are all sorts of other issues to look at. This proposal, for instance, says it's being done. The first stage is still under the Exit Convention, basically. And so I think what's happened there is simply someone designing an Exit Convention tribunal, but then slapping a title on it. But then, in order to expand the next phase to where you want it to be, it has to be a multilateral treaty.
Howie?
Thank you. Is the shift in substantive law in TTIP, and really, I guess, CETA by extension, because that's the best marker of what's likely to end up in TTIP, fundamental enough to address the labor, environment, other related issues? And I think the answer to that is no. It could be if you actually have a system where you can get a jurisprudence that stays consistent. And so related to the shift in the tribunal, it could be the end result would be, but there's no guarantee. And fundamentally, the biggest problem, I think, comes in two factors. One is the FET clause, which is drawn from the Waste Management 2 case under NAFTA, and is the basis of the Bilcon decision, which is, I think it's fair to say, at best extremely controversial, and which most environmentalists see as sort of rabidly dangerous to environmental regulation, not just in North America, but to wherever that language appears, and that is the precise language. It is absolutely the precise language that we see in the CETA text on fair and equitable treatment. So if that can, if that precise language can produce the Bilcon case, then there needs to be some serious thinking, I think, about the scope of that language now and where to go with it. And there are alternatives that reduce the risk of going in that direction. I think we see issues on indirect expropriation being tightened up a little bit, but it can still be taken sort of the next step further, as other treaties have done. But the bigger problem is the rights of foreign investors under the treaty are still disconnected from legal obligations. There are 3 legal obligations that are essentially made binding: anti-corruption, anti-fraud, in the making of an investment. And there's a third sort of category that goes with that. Those are made binding by precluding an investor access to the dispute settlement system if they've achieved their investment through fraud or corruption. So there's an obligation and an enforcement mechanism. But you don't have that in terms of environmental issues, in terms of labor standards, in terms of human rights issues. You don't have a similar mechanism in terms of civil liability issues. And we know today through locational choices, the same word that the lawyers love to use in their defense of these corporate structures, we know that through locational choices, investors are very adept at achieving levels of rights through these treaties and shielding themselves from all civil liability through other types of locational choices. So you literally have rights without responsibilities and without liabilities. And as long as that can still match up, the system is never going to be balanced. A treaty can be designed to match those two up, though, and make sure that the rights are matched with obligations and acceptance of liabilities.
Thank you. Una, may we go into the next panel for 5 minutes, or would you prefer that we postpone questions until afterwards? So we can take 1 or 2 questions if we have any from the audience. Stephen?
Thank you. I wanted to ask Hugo Perescano, my old friend and sparring partner, a question about his point distinguishing international and national. And I'll illustrate the question with an anecdote, namely a reported conversation at a Washington cocktail party somewhere around 1993. We need NAFTA to get around Mexico's legal system because it's too bad. We need NAFTA to get around Canada's legal system because it's too good. What's your position on these two systems having different standards if the international system is inferior to the already established national system?
In the case it is inferior to the national system, I mean, that may be really probably a very subjective question. Even, for instance, the US system, is it a developed democracy system if you look at the Lowen case, to name at least one example in this context? I don't know. In investment agreements, let's remember, and it goes to one of Howie's points earlier on, the way it is designed right now is to protect foreign investment elsewhere. And those rules apply sort of across countries with at least an intention to get to some uniformity. While there may be varying standards, the rules themselves are not all that different. So it seems to me that there is an intention to provide that uniformity, sort of a level playing field worldwide, without going into the issues of which system is better than others. In many cases, I'm sure, I'll say this from experience, when we were negotiating NAFTA, Mexico was clear that our system was inferior to at least what policymakers in Mexico wanted it to be at the time. And in part, we negotiated NAFTA to bring our standards up. But I don't know whether Venezuelan politicians would agree that their system is inferior or superior to the US or Canadian systems. At any rate, I think that investment protection is meant to bring some uniformity in terms of what standards apply to protect companies that are willing to invest in risk capital elsewhere, and especially in countries where that lack own resources and heavily rely on foreign capitals. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
we'll continue later.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. I think there we will stop with this panel so that we can cede the floor to Mark and his panelists. But I know that at the end of the day, we have the opportunity for some more broad questions. So you have some time to think up questions for our panelists. But right now, please join me in giving them a hand and thanking them for their contributions.
Thanks so much, Andrea, and very well managed with such a large panel.
developing democracies. I don't like the terminology. I think it's confusing. I think it blurs one of the issues. I like more the reference to developing and developed countries. It is tied into, well, there is no universally accepted definition of what is a developed country or a developing country. It is used by international organizations. It is tied into objective economic indicators, and I think it reflects the level of economic development does reflect on a country's institutions, whether they are more or less responsive, on whether their regulatory systems are, again, more or less responsive as well. And I think it's hard to, I wonder, and I've been wondering throughout the morning, what or who defines what is a developed democracy as opposed to a developing or underdeveloped democracy. So I try to stay away from that terminology. Anyhow, having made that clarification at the outset, I think it raises the question of whether some countries should selectively exclude investor-state dispute settlement or even just the arbitration part of dispute settlement selectively from certain agreement raises a host of questions. I don't think it resolves any problems. As David Schneiderman said earlier on, I think that I would fully agree with you that ISDS is not going to go away for the foreseeable future. So whether some countries begin to exclude it or not, countries are still going to face, and I would say the same countries will continue to face these cases, and probably or most likely incrementally. So again, I don't think it resolves any question and any problems, and it raises or creates others. So one of the things, somebody said it, I think it was Charles-Emmanuel this morning, who pointed to the issue. I think one of the points that has been overlooked is that there is really, I don't think there is a big overlap, if there is any overlap at all, between the type of issues that ISDS is meant to address as opposed to domestic law. Investor-state dispute settlement is a forum to resolve international law claims. And while there may be similar protections, and of course we heard Julie this morning,
task of covering the rest of the world compared to what we've already looked at. Our speakers have very kindly agreed to keep very strictly to time because we have several speakers and not very much time. So we will go in the order they appear on the program, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Hugo Perez-Cano Diaz, and I will not repeat what is in the bios of our speakers because in the interest of time, but it is a great pleasure to have Hugo lead us off.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here to share the floor and the conference with my distinguished colleagues, longtime friends, and be part of this panel. So I thank CIGI for organizing the event, having invited me to write a paper on this topic, and being able to participate today. The paper that I wrote addresses the possible reaction of developing countries if developed countries were to begin excluding ISDS from agreements between themselves. Now, we've heard a lot during the course of the morning about developing democracy, developed and at least raising or asking the question whether certain systems, the German system as opposed to others, offer more or less protection than the international law or the international rules do. The truth is that we are dealing with two separate systems of law. And international dispute settlement is meant to address claims of violations to international law, not domestic law claims. And even if we're dealing with the same issue, the standards may be quite different. Even if both domestic law and international law offer protections against expropriation, for instance, the standards may be quite different. In some cases, it may be argued that the domestic standards are better standards than those that provided for at international law. And in other cases, it may be different. But the questions, again, the standards are different. And one of the main problems that I see here is that by withdrawing or retreating from ISDS generally, if, for instance, a country's ability to regulate is hindered in any way, it is really not because of the dispute settlement system, but actually because of the substantive rules that are written into
Okay, so if we could, I think we'll start with the next panel. So if Andrea, if you could come forward with your team, that would be wonderful. So we need Andrea Bjorklund, Ugo Perezcano Diaz, Uchiero Onwumegbu, Howard Mann, and Elizabeth Turk by video. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea Bjorklund. I teach at McGill University in Montreal, and I'm delighted to be here. I thank Armand and Una for the invitation. So I have the honor of chairing our panel with a somewhat daunting